Now, when it comes to clockwise and counterclockwise, I've learned in my half century of living to always think about that twice. Because I can't tell you how many times I've righty-tighty, lefty-loosey'd the wrong way. Well, hello once again, and welcome to the Guitar Foster Parent. I'm your host, John McLain. It's been a while. It's been a long while, 6 weeks or so, and I apologize for the long gap between episodes. I haven't forgotten about you, and nothing has happened to me. Not directly. I've had some family things to take care of and some other work that's had to be done. I mean, the Guitar Foster Parent is a hobby, and as such, it has to take a back seat sometimes when other things come up. But I'm glad to be back with you here for the next episode on the Guitar Foster Parent. I hope you've subscribed to our channel and hit the notification bell. If you'd like to do that, you can certainly do it down in the corner of the screen right now and get subscribed in as we move through our projects. And if you're new to the channel, I want to welcome you especially. Let you know that we have a trailer video there on the YouTube channel that you can watch that tells why we're here, what inspired us to get started here at GFP, and what the goals are. So I wanted to make you aware of that. Also, you can go back and get reacquainted on our current project, which we're nearing the end of. This is our Harmony 2814 project that we've been working on, and we're almost done with this baby here. We're to the setup process now. And to briefly recap, we have gone through and cleaned is the main thing we've done. We did polish the frets. We sanded the frets down a little bit. They were a bit grooved, so we sanded them, gave them a polish. We replaced the nut, new tuners on the guitar. And so we're now to the point where we're ready to start talking about setup. But before we go there, I want to let you know about something that happened part of the past 6 weeks or so since we were last together. You might recall that we put a new input jack in our guitar, and I've got it plugged into a tuner right now. But this input jack is a very nice 4-point contact jack that I put in. We did a video on that earlier, which involves some soldering. Did the thing and put it in, but I didn't test it. And one of the rules I've learned whenever you're fixing something, the one thing that you don't test is the one thing that's not going to work. And guess what? It didn't work. So as I was preparing to think about doing a setup video, and I thought, well, I need to go ahead and plug in my tuner, guess what? No sound. So I removed the strings, pulled the pick guard, did some testing, and I rolled some video. Here's what that looked like. This is a little bonus coverage here as I strung up the guitar. My next step was going to be to prepare for the next video, to tune it up, let the string stretch, retune, and that's the way we begin the setup. When the guitar is in tune at the proper tension, we can then begin exploring setup. I only had one problem. When I plugged in my chromatic tuner here, I had no signal. I wasn't getting any signal from the jack, and I also plugged into an amplifier, no signal whatsoever. I don't know if you're like me, but have you ever had one of those moments where you kind of knew what you did wrong and you knew that you should have checked before and you got in a hurry? Well, that's what bit me. I was sitting around thinking about what could be wrong, and I discovered that I probably wired this backwards. On a guitar cable, let me get in close so you can see this. On a guitar cable, you've got, this is an unbalanced line, and so you have a ground and you have a signal, a ring or a tip and a sleeve, okay? The tip is the signal, and then the sleeve is the ground. When you plug this into a jack, the contacts, and this is that multi-point jack that we talked about, you'll note that the contacts, these little ears where I soldered the wires, if you remember, connect to certain contacts. So this, obviously, at the tip here is what's going to contact the tip of the cable or the signal. And then this lower ear right here is going to contact the sleeve or the ground. if you'll notice, and I suspected this when I opened it up, if you'll notice and look carefully, look what I did. This red wire, which is the signal wire, is actually soldered to the ear that makes contact here, which is the sleeve. So it's backwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the solder here and reverse these wires. And then I'll do a quick cleaning, string it back up, and test for the signal. One other thing that I could have done is use a multimeter to test for continuity. So these meters have the ability to send a signal through a wire and make sure that it's coming out on the other end. Very handy for things like cars and things where you want to see if your wire is shorted or pinched or cut or something like that. I didn't do that. In fact, this doesn't stay up here. This stays down in my garage. Had I done that, I probably would have saved myself a little bit of work. But in any case, visually, I checked, and sure enough, I got this thing backwards. So I'm gonna have to remove my beautiful solders and redo it. Well, we've resoldered, reversed the wires, and I wanted to go ahead and shoot. This time, we're gonna be more wise and test with our multimeter. This particular model has a setting down here that'll give you a tone to test connectivity. So we just turn down to that setting, and then it will make an audible tone if a connection is made between these two leads, like that. So what we want to do is test, obviously, one end to the ground wire and test our sleeve connector, which is what we had backwards. And I'm gonna, you probably can't see this on the camera, but I'm gonna go down here and test where the sleeve grips. And you can hear that we have a signal. The test for the signal, we just go in here and find, so here's a red lead right here. And then we're going to touch to the actual part that's going to touch the guitar cable to test. And you can see we have a signal. So I don't know if you can hear that signal on the camera, but I've tested it. Sorry about that. Got it backwards, but I guess it gives us an opportunity to learn together. Now back to the episode. So the moral of the story is always test. Hopefully I've learned my lesson. You know, it's so easy to get in a hurry with this stuff because it's fun. It's fun tinkering with these guitars, and it's really fun when you wrap up, you know, something you want to replace or repair. And when you kind of finish that process, there's a satisfaction, and it can kind of get in the way of the due diligence of testing your work. But I'm happy to report now that the jack does give a good signal. It communicates, sounds good. We've got no noise. We just had to get it soldered correctly. Anyway, back to where we are now. Today, let's talk about setup. Oh, before we do that, I want to remind you, if you're a fan of a Guitar Foster Parent, I've got some stuff I want to send you, and I'd be happy to do it for free. A couple things that help promote the channel here. I've got these really nice Guitar Foster Parent decals that include a QR code that will send folks right to the channel. I'd like to send you a few of these, and I've got the official Guitar Foster Parent guitar pick that I'd like to send you, and it also on the back has the QR code to take you over to the channel. I'd like to send you these goodies in the mail. If you'll just drop me a private message at john@guitarfosterparent.com and give me your mailing address. I would love to send these out to you. No strings, no charging. I'm not going to add you to a mailing list and sell your information. I don't even know how to do that anyway. But I'd like to let you promote the channel. That's the one thing I would ask you to do is, you know, stick that baby on your guitar case or on your vehicle or whatever, and let people know. Maybe they'll scan the code and we'll have another friend here at the Guitar Foster Parent. Again, it's john@guitarfosterparent.com, and I'd be delighted to send you a little care package with a few of each of those. All right, setting up a guitar. So we've put a new input jack in like we talked about. Actually did it twice, but we got it right the second time. Got all this cleaned up, everything's tested, bridge is reinstalled, we got our ground here underneath the bridge and the tailpiece is on. That's all cleaned, fretboard is oiled, reconditioned, frets are good, we got strings on. Now, one thing I do want to say from the outset, we did put a new nut. In fact, that was the first thing we did on this guitar. The nut was broken, had a big chunk out of it, and so we went ahead and replaced it because it's a cheap thing to do. However, when you get a new guitar nut, the manufacturer will put, these are made of bone, and they'll basically put guidelines. They'll just score a little line, because they measure the distance between the strings. But it's really not a slot for the string to sit in. It's just basically a guide for you to file it to the correct depth. And that's fine because, every guitar will need a different nut height. Here's a problem that I ran into. In order, the strings will set in that little score line, that little guide groove. But the problem is it's so high. I mean, if you look at how tall this nut is, it's so high that the strings were so tall that I wasn't able to measure the truss rod. The tolerances were way out for my gauges. And you might say, what gauges? We'll talk about that in just a minute. The reason I'm telling you this up front is I had to pre-file the nut a little bit, which is not the final filing, but I had to file it down to where the strings would sit low enough where I could measure. Now, they're not low enough. There's probably going to be some more filing necessary on the nut. We'll get to that when we talk about that. And I do want to show you here, I didn't get them out of my drawer here. Again, from Music Nomad, we're going to talk a little bit about Music Nomad today. I have several of their tools. They're all wonderful. They're very, very good. The most expensive is this toolkit that I have, and this is a set of 6 nut files. And these are just little diamond edge files designed to file bone nuts. And they have, numbers denoting the thickness of them. And you can see this is just a very fine, it's almost like a blade. This is the smallest one. This is for the number 1 string. Anyway, so I had to file those out a little bit off camera so that I could get to the truss rod for the measurements. So we will go back to that later on when we do the final fitting of the nut height, the grooves in the nut height. But I wanted to mention that. All right, first thing we're going to do is do a truss rod check. Now, if you're new to guitars and you don't know what a truss rod is, inside the neck of most guitars, there's a metal rod. And that metal rod is threaded at one end so that you can adjust the tension of it. And what happens is it's fastened at one end, and in this particular guitar it's fastened down here, and the adjustment screw is at the top near the headstock. And what happens is when you tighten, in other words, you shorten the truss rod, it puts tension and bows the neck. Okay, makes sense? You tighten the metal, wood is softer than metal, the wood's going to give, and you're going to bow the neck. This can adjust the flatness of the neck, and depending on the gauge of strings, if you're using a very heavy gauge of string, it takes a lot more tension to get it in tune. It's going to put a lot more stress between the tailpiece and the tuners here, and it's going to pull that neck. That truss rod actually more often is used to flatten the neck. It forces, when you lengthen the truss rod, it takes the bow out of it. And so most of the time, that's what you need to do. Obviously, alternatively, if you use a very light set of strings, and by the way, before we go any further, I want to tell you on this guitar we have, these are very, very common, Ernie Ball Super Slinkies. These are played by almost everybody. There are other fine brands. The other thing I like about these strings, they're not expensive. You can get a 10-pack of these sets for pretty cheap. These go from 9 to 42, okay, in case you're wondering. These are the strings that are on this guitar right now. So that's a fairly light gauge, and so the truss rod, not under a ton of stress. However, I don't know what the adjustment on this guitar was before we got started. So we're going to check it. How do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use some tools from this Music Nomad Equipment Care kit. This is a great kit. It's not terribly expensive. Music Nomad, by the way, has a lot of their offerings on Amazon. You can probably buy them at Guitar Center and other places. Amazon obviously is convenient. And inside this kit, some really fantastic things. I mentioned this little magic booklet. This booklet is absolutely wonderful. This is basically a guitar setup for dummies guide. It's designed for people like me who aren't professionally trained luthiers and want to do my own setup. Give it a try. This thing has some wonderful tools in it. Here are what they are. This is an interesting tool. This is a pick capo that comes in the kit that you use on the first fret, and I'm going to show you how that works here in just a second. It's really just a really thick guitar pick that's designed for use, and I'll show you that. There's a number of gauges inside this kit. One is a nut height gauge. That's what this is right here. And if you fan this open, you'll see a number of precision pieces of metal. If you've ever gapped spark plugs for a car, this is the same kind of idea. These are very thin, precision pieces of metal to the thousandth of an inch that help you measure gaps between the strings and the frets. And so this one is used for nut height, and it's really nice. I mean, it folds up into a little to keep you from bending them. There's another gauge that we're going to use today. This is the same kind of thing. This is a truss rod gauge, okay? And again, very thin, precision, so you want to be careful with this. And I like the fact that it folds down to protect these from getting bent, because obviously if this gets bent or kinked, then it's not going to be accurate anymore. So we're going to use that today. Also inside this kit, there are a couple of radius gauges. So the radius, you can see this has a curve in it. That's how you measure the radius of your fretboard, which can be important when you're setting intonation. We'll use this later on in our setup process. And then this amazingly powerful tool is a string action gauge. And what Guitar Nomad has done is they've just taken a piece of metal and they have precision printed very fine measurements, and included right there on there is a chart. So you can see for electric guitars, acoustic guitars, and basses, they give suggested action heights, and then you can measure them using the tiny scales on this little, this is an ingenious little gauge here. Really, really neat. So that comes in the kit as well. So powerful tools to be used to do a setup on an electric, acoustic, or a bass. And in fact, I use this kit to set up the OG Precision bass hanging on the wall behind me. I use this very kit and just use the bass measurements. So it's a good kit. And so we're going to be using part of that today for the truss rod. For the truss rod adjustment, we're going to need two pieces of this kit. One is the pick capo that I described for you earlier, and obviously the truss rod gauge. And I'm going to show you that in detail right now. This is an electric guitar, and so inside the truss rod gauge, there are three choices on this particular gauge. And I'm going to hold these up. These are etched into, they're kind of laser etched into the metal. They may not show up on the camera, but you can see there's one for classical guitar, one for electric bass, and what else does it say on there? Oh, acoustic or electric bass. And then the electric guitar one right here. And you can see these are measured to the thousandth of an inch. We're going to use, obviously, the electric guitar one. So I'm going to fold the rest of these up. You know, again, I'm going to be very careful. These are extremely thin. This one is 6/1000ths of an inch. So it's very thin and somewhat delicate. So I'm going to be very careful with it. But we're going to use this and the first fret pick capo, these two tools from the kit, to do our truss rod setup. So, with all that introductory stuff out of the way, let's get started. All right, to begin, I wanted to move the camera so you can see the nut and first fret area of the guitar. We're going to now place this first fret pick capo. And again, this is just a thick guitar pick, is really all it is. In a triangular shape, they've developed this to provide a specific tension and thickness to give you a good result. Here's how you use this thing. What you do is you see this groove or this mark that they've printed on here, two parallel lines. That represents the first fret on the guitar, which is obviously right here. The way that you set this is you want to thread it underneath string number 5, the A string, and then put it, you know, a lot of times people will actually carry their picks in their guitar case like this. You know, you thread it between the strings. But in this case, you want to line up these parallel lines with the first fret, and it's noted first fret. Point the pick toward the bridge, so point it down away from the nut, and then make sure it's even and nice and straight so that the point lines up with, in this case, the 5th string, which is the A string. Now notice what this is doing. This is actually putting specific pressure down on string 4 and string 6. String 6 is the important one in this case because this is how we're going to measure using our nut height, or truss rod gauge, rather. And the same thing as with the nut height one. We'll get to that at another time. Notice printed right here on the gauge, and again, these Music Nomad tools are great. They really, really are. They thought these through. There's instructions right here on the gauge. I don't know if you can see that, but it says to measure at the 6th fret, and there's even smiley faces. We're going to use something called the touch rule. I'm going to describe that to you in a bit to measure this, but this gauge is going to go under the 6th fret with the pick capo in place. Make sense? And so our guide here from our Music Nomad kit says this: use the pick capo to hold down the low E string against the 1st fret, which we've done. Slide under the A string and on top of D. So we've done that. Next, we're going to find the correct feeler gauge. They call these feeler gauges for our instrument. We've already selected electric guitar, and so we've got that ready to go. The instrument is in tune. I pre-tuned it with our trusty Fender chromatic tuner that I've got plugged into the guitar here. That now is trying to fall off my workbench. There we go. So the guitar's in tune. Now they say to put it in playing position, meaning set it on your knee or strap it on, how you would play it in the playing position. The problem is that's going to be very hard to video. I've actually asked around why they say that. The reason is because obviously with the guitar on a neck rest like it is now, the weight of the instrument is changing slightly the dynamic. In other words, the neck might be slightly, have some downward pressure on it because of where it is, whereas if I'm playing it, the neck is free from that and is actually turned this way. And then also the gravity pulls the strings down. There are some very slight, in my mind, and again, if someone was paying me $500 to set this guitar up, I would probably be a lot more precise. But for the purposes of the guitar foster parent, I want it to have a decent setup, okay? Whoever winds up with this instrument may want to go and have a precision setup done, and that's fine. But for the purposes of learning, we're not going to put the guitar in the playing position. We're going to leave it on the bench just like this. I can't imagine it's going to make much of a difference, but I just wanted to mention that it is in the instructions. Now, time to measure. We've got our feeler gauge. It says, with your finger, press the low E string, or string 6, down at the 12th fret. Okay, here's fret number 12 right here. I'm going to press it down just as if I was playing it. So again, I'm not going to press down. I'm just going to fret the guitar at fret number 12. And then we're going to take our feeler gauge and slide it under the E string, the low E string, string 6, at the 6th fret. Now we want to do it at the fret, not between the frets. So we'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's the 6th fret. So the touch rule says when I slide this feeler gauge in here, if it won't go in, if you have to basically push it in, then that means that the truss rod needs an adjustment. And if there's a big gap, the truss rod needs an adjustment. Okay? So in other words, I'm going to release this and just kind of show you this. If I put, say this is the 6th fret, and you can see there is a lot of space right here. That would mean that the guitar neck needs to be flattened out, right? Because as I flatten it out, the strings are going to get closer to the frets. Alternatively, if you can't fit it in there, if there's a lot of tension where I have to force this in and it's basically, if I have to kind of, then the touch rule says that we need to take the truss rod and go the other way with it, that the strings are too low, so we need to put more bow in it. You get the idea. That's what the touch rule says. We basically want the feeler gauge to barely touch, a light touch, and you can see right here they even put, it says light smiley face. That means we're happy. So let's measure this. So again, I'm going to hold down the string at the 6th fret, or the 12th fret, and measure at fret number 6, which is right here. I'm going to hold it by this little, this kind of makes a nice finger hold here, this little ring that the gauge is put together. And again, pressing with normal pressure on fret 12, Here we go. All right. I can tell you, and again, this is impossible to see on the video, but I can tell you, if you'll trust me, the gauge slides without making contact. You know, I'm not having to push the string, and I can tell you that I think we're good. I'm moving the gauge up and down, and I'm contacting the string. I don't feel the gauge moving up and down at all. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the guitar and I'm going to turn it slightly so it's at my eye level, and I'm going to look in there as I do this. And this is also, you know, a reason that playing position might be a good idea. Again, where am I? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right here. So looking in here, I see a gap. Okay. I can tell you that there is a slight bit of light coming through, and I can see it because I've got a white towel on my bench, so it really, you know, shows that white line. There is a gap there. Okay? So, according to my gauge, I'm going to set this back down. There's no touch. Okay, we're not touching here. And so this tells me that I need to make a clockwise adjustment on the truss rod. So, I'm going to unplug my tuner just so I'm not knocking it off the bench. So let me show you that. And I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but on this particular guitar, this has a headstock truss rod adjustment. And it is a hex key, and right here in this little drilled out area, inside there is where the truss rod adjustment is. And to adjust that, we're going to use a hex wrench. Now, Guitar Nomad, a number of other guitar tool makers, they make truss rod wrenches. You can also just use these guys. You know, you can go to your local tool store, you may even have these lying around. The adjustments you're going to make on the truss rod, the number one rule on this is less is more. Okay, this truss rod is going to be pretty hard to turn because obviously you are forcing a pretty thick and stiff piece of wood to flex. The last thing you want to do is wrench it down, because what's probably going to happen? It could crack, split the neck, and then Bob's your uncle. You've got to get a new neck. So less is more. Tiny little adjustments. What I will say is that the guide suggests this as well, and it just makes logical sense. Little tiny adjustments. 1/8 of a turn is going to make a pretty big difference in this guitar neck. And so we're going to find the correct size wrench for our nut adjustment, and then we're going to go ahead and adjust the truss rod. Well, after some checking, I've gone and gotten some more tools. I've got a bunch of different Allen wrench sets or hex keys, however you want to refer to them. This set I showed you earlier is a non-metric. It's an SAE set. I could not get any of these to fit, so I thought, well, it's metric. So I went and got my metric set, which is one of these little fold-up things from Harbor Freight. And I couldn't get access to the port with this big clunky handle, so I took it apart and removed the wrench. This is the 4mm size, and I think it's correct. The reason I say I think is because of this string saddle right here, or the string tree. I'm not able to get the wrench down to where I can get it all the way in. So I wanted to mention this. The last thing you want to do, aside from setting this on fire somehow, is to strip the hex key for the truss rod. If you strip that, I mean, that is a capital D disaster. So, as big of a pain as it is, I'm going to have to pull this tension off of these strings, remove these from the string tree, and then probably remove the string tree itself because my wrench is flat. Maybe this is why, you know, people like Music Nomad and others make specific truss rod sets. They probably have these handy 90-degree, you know, kind of like this set right here. you know, but this doesn't fit. So, and I don't have a metric set like this. So I'm going to make do with the tools that I have. And I'm going to add some extra steps, but you know, we'll pull the strings loose. We won't have to remove them. We'll just move them to the side. We'll get in, we'll make a slight adjustment, then we'll have to put them back on, retune it, and go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my first fret pick capo, and let's go ahead and pull the tension off. Okay, so now I've taken the tension off of strings 3 and 4, and I've removed the string tree. Now I'm going to see if I have better access to get this wrench in nice and flat, to make sure this is even the right size. I believe it is. Okay. Now turning this may be another story. We're going to try it out with the strings on. We may end up having to remove, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I can already see if I'm going to be turning this clockwise. Well, we'll leave it like it is for now. Okay, so my instructions told me that I needed to turn the truss rod slightly clockwise, and so I'm going to do that. Obviously, that's going to be hard to do because this tiny little wrench, and again, I hope you have better tools, it's going to be hard to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a screwdriver and use it as a handle. So I'm going to just take, you know, a screwdriver here. And so turning it clockwise, if I'm looking down at the truss rod nut, clockwise would be toward me. Now, when it comes to clockwise and counterclockwise, I've learned in my half century of living to always think about that twice, because I can't tell you how many times I've righty-tighty, lefty-loosey'd the wrong way. So I'm going to look again. I'm going to imagine a clock. Okay, so yes, I'm going to turn the wrench this way toward me. And again, remember when we had our feeler gauge, it was a very, very slight gap. I'm thinking 1/8 of a turn might be enough. And this is one of those trial and error things. So I've got the wrench firmly seated. I'm going to check again. And what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try not to damage the strings in doing this, is I'm going to turn this guy slightly to the right. And see, the strings are in my way, so I am going to have to pull. So let's get 1 and 2 off here. Pull this guy out of the string tree, and see if we can pull him off. Get back in the picture here. All right, now we're going to get our screwdriver in here, and we're just going to use this as a handle to turn the truss rod slightly clockwise. You're going to have to hold the headstock down because it's going to try to turn the whole guitar over again. These things are always tight. Take your time here. Don't rush. Okay. You can see my wrench position has changed slightly. Now I'm going to remove my wrench, put the guitar back together, you know, put the strings back on, get us in tune, and then we'll see how we did. Okay, so we're restrung, guitar's back in tune. Turn my tuner off there. Now, let's repeat the process for the truss rod. We've moved it slightly, so we're going to put our pick capo back where it goes, remembering to get it nice and lined up. Okay, just like that. We have our feeler gauge. We're going to press down at the 12th fret, measure between the string and the 6th, and see what we get. Ah, Okay, I already noticed a difference without even looking. I think we're in good shape now. So like I did before, I'm going to do the playing position because it helps me see better. I'm going to kind of hold the guitar by the hook here with my wrist so that I can still apply the 12th fret here. And now I'm going to look, slide this down a little bit so I can see my white towel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh yeah. Yeah. Now it's making contact with the string, but it's not moving the string, which is what we want. If I had to force the feeler gauge in where it would move the string, but now I don't see that thin line of white and I can actually feel the string touching the feeler gauge. Isn't that interesting? Maybe that's why they named it that. I don't know. So, according to these instructions, the truss rod is adjusted correctly. Now, we only check this string, the idea being that the neck is flat, it's not twisted. If the neck on your guitar is twisted, none of this is going to work. This is all based upon the fact that you've got a nice straight neck. And so, as we talked about early on, when you acquire an instrument, especially, if it's inexpensive, then sometimes you'll have a neck that's made out of a piece of wood that shouldn't have been used for a guitar neck. And to save money, they did it anyway, and the neck is twisted. In other words, when you look down the plane of the guitar neck, you'll see a twist in the top of the fretboard. And, we talked about when you go to a guitar shop, often, if you're trading in an instrument, one of the first things the guy will do at the pawn shop or whatever is they'll do one of these. They'll look down and make sure the neck is not twisted visually, because that's something you can't fix. You're looking at putting a new neck on the guitar if that happens. Truss rod will not fix a twisted neck, and in many cases will make it worse. So anyway, I'm going to remove my pick capo, and now we know that our truss rod is adjusted. Okay, so this was actually a pretty easy truss rod adjustment. I've had to do some truss rods that were problematic, and frankly some that I've done before, I really could never get them in an acceptable range for whatever reason. This one actually behaved pretty well. A couple of things I want to remind you of. Truss rod nuts are usually very, very tight. And in many cases, when you get a guitar, it's likely that the truss rod hasn't been touched since the guitar is manufactured. And as you can imagine, if sweat gets down in here or what have you, it can bind up. One of the things that the Music Nomad booklet suggested, if you can't get if the truss rod seems frozen and you can't get it to turn, one thing they suggest is try turning it the opposite direction of the direction you're wanting to make the adjustment. Sometimes that will break it loose and enable it to turn. You can try a dot of 3-in-1 oil on there, not too much. You don't want oil getting down inside the neck, but just a dot of 3-in-1 oil. I wouldn't use WD-40 because that's a solvent. But a little 3-in-1 oil, something like that, might help break it loose, let it sit for a while. You don't want to force the truss rod, okay? If you strip it, you're in trouble. If it breaks loose all of a sudden, you make a huge fast adjustment and you crack the neck, you're in trouble. So be very, very careful. It's better to have your truss rod off a little than to break the guitar. But now, according to our feeler gauges and our little tools here, our truss rod should be correct. So, coming up next time, we're going to talk about the action of the strings. Now that we know our truss rod is good, when our guitar is under tension, one of the big things that players like is a certain type of action. And when we talk about action, we're talking about the distance it takes to press down a string to make useful contact with a fret to produce a clean note. If it's a very high action, that means the strings are sitting high off the fretboard and you have to push a lot further. Most players, especially of electrics, like a lower action. Of course, the danger is if it's too low, when the string vibrates, it will make contact with the fret and will cause buzzing. So where is the happy medium on string action? Well, to get there, we're going to get inside our kit here next time, and we're going to use this handy gauge I showed you earlier. That is if I can get it out here, right here. This little precision card, if you will, says string action gauge. And on here, there are ways that we can measure the string action. We'll talk about the different ways to adjust it. And this guitar will be a neat case study because this guitar has a fixed bridge. We can adjust the bridge as a whole, but we don't have individual saddles. We have a unisaddle, if you will, for all 6 strings. So to adjust this, it's either going to all come up and down, or we can, of course, adjust it this way. Next time on the Guitar Foster Parent, we'll talk about how to make that determination, and we'll see about getting these adjusted. After that, we'll talk about intonation, which is the distance between the saddle and the nut. And of course, as you change that distance, that can change the intonation of the guitar. We'll talk about what that means. And then we'll wrap it up with pickup height and nut height. We'll go ahead and get this nut adjusted to where it needs to be. And we'll pick up all of that and a whole lot more coming up on the Guitar Foster Parent. Please like and subscribe, and welcome to the channel. Click the notification bell if you would. And again, if you'd like some of our swag free of charge, send me an email at john@guitarfosterparent.com. That's john@guitarfosterparent.com, right below me here. And then I'd be happy to send you a few decals, a few pics that you can share with your friends, and share the channel with others as we try to share this really fun hobby of taking unwanted, unloved instruments like this old harmony, fixing them up and making them play nice and having them make music again in a forever home. Who's going to be the owner of this guitar? If you want to nominate somebody, let me know that as well at john@guitarfosterparent.com. We'll see you next time when we again start to work on string action on the Guitar Foster Parent. Bye-bye for now.